Good day, denizens. Welcome to our discussion now on the Mongols as we keep talking about the spread of civilization in East Asia. We've talked about China with the Tang and the Tang and the Song to an extent, and now, in the midst of the Tang Empire being around, we also had some Mongols lurking, and they end up, of course, taking over the entirety of the Song Empire. Nonetheless, so here you see a statue of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, of course, you might have heard of him. Still today highly revered in Mongolian society. But a little background on him. Genghis Khan's real name, Temujin, who later became known as Genghis Khan, which basically means world conqueror. When he was a boy, his father was poisoned by a rival Mongol clan. At the age of 15, Temujin was then taken prisoner. For the rest of his life, he never forgot this humiliation of being locked in a wooden collar and paraded before his enemies. Though he ended up regaining his freedom eventually, Temujin wandered among drifting clans. He was later adopted and grew up with a reputation for courage, leadership, and brutality and a little bit of anger. He actually murdered his older stepbrother while his stepbrother was fishing. Temujin snuck up behind him just to see how well he could hunt and kill somebody without them noticing. He pulled it off. He took revenge on the clan that had imprisoned him, and in time became the supreme ruler of all the Mongols. And once despised, Khan would be admired and feared across 2 continents. And to this day, about 16 million men have DNA from Genghis Khan, i.e. are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. So what we're getting at here, how did the Mongols end up conquering and ruling such a vast empire that's going to stretch from Eastern Europe, modern day, all the way to the modern day Western? And 2, what were the effects of Mongol rule in China? Few terms, obviously Genghis Khan, kind of an important term in this case. The Asian steppe, the broad Central Asian region from which the Mongolians ruled. The so-called Pax Mongolica, in other words, the Mongolian peace, very much like how we have the Pax Romana, we have the Pax Mongolica, and some psychological warfare for you coming up as well. The picture there, that's actually Genghis Khan's mausoleum, even though he's not actually there. That, of course, is in Mongolia, and like I said, Genghis Khan, very highly revered to this day in Mongolian society. And basically at this place here, he's worshipped as an ancestor, the dynastic founder, but also, yes, a deity. Khan's body, though, has never actually been found. He requested that his body be buried in an unmarked grave, and it still hasn't been found, and actually people continue to search for it to this day. So who were these Mongols? I mean, they were a tough, rugged people who could fight like nobody's business. They could travel for days on their horse. They would drink mare's milk, just eat a few handfuls of grain. They were the most skilled horsemen on the planet, even riding, without a saddle. They could still do that and shoot a bow and arrow. Simply amazing. If they wanted to get some protein, what they would do in the morning, you go out on the hunt and then, carve up the animal, get you a chunk of meat, and just hold that between your leg and the horse throughout the day. And then by the end of the day, from the body heat from the horse, that's warmed up your meat. So that makes a good dinner. Yeah. Marco Polo gives us a lot of the information that we know on the Mongols. From his A Description of the World, Polo said, "They keep hovering about the enemy, discharging their arrows first from one side and then from the other. Their horses are so well broken in to quick changes of movement that upon the signal given, they instantly turn in any direction. And by these rapid maneuvers, many victories have been obtained." You don't say, Marco. And the Mongols, the term Mong actually means brave. So these would be the brave people, brave men, the Mongols. So the Mongols really burst out of Central Asia, Mongolia, right around 1200, a little earlier than that. And they end up overrunning the Song Empire in China and imposed their will. And obviously, the Mongols were nomadic. They were always on the move. It's not going to be until we get to really to Kublai Khan that we start seeing more of a sedentary type of Mongol, and they're going to create these things called khanates. I'll talk about here in a second. Um, but the thing is, for the longest time, the Mongols were not united. They were, rival clans fighting against each other. But then by the early 1200s, good old Temujin, who takes on the name Genghis Khan, or World Emperor, ends up uniting these Mongol groups. And under Genghis Khan, the Mongols are going to control an empire that stretches from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Simply amazing. And here you can see on the map just how wide and how quickly the Mongol Empire spread. And then you see the colors there at the end. That's indicative of the Mongol Empire eventually breaking up into what we call the Khanates. In other words, an empire ruled by a Khan. But check out how far it spreads in so few years. And you can see here, later on, once this broad empire is split up, mostly between the grandkids, essentially, of Genghis Khan, and then his children later on. And basically, they would create these khanates, these large empires. And you can also see on here the route Marco Polo traveled. He is one of our major sources on the Mongols because he traveled so widely. Visiting these peoples, or at least he claimed to have. It's probably more like his uncle that did it, but nonetheless, I think his brother-in-law, yeah. This also shows us a lot of other things, like the campaigns of Genghis Khan there with the red arrows. I mean, dude is on the move. Of course, traversing this amount of land is a little bit easier because it's so flat across the Asian plain, but still, that's a lot of roaming around. So Genghis Khan imposed basically, a strict military discipline. You were loyal to him without question. And if there's ever any question about your loyalty, well, that question didn't last long. He wasn't afraid to massacre the entirety of a city just to set them as an example. But at the same time, the guy could be generous. Sometimes he'd roll up into a city with his army and see that so many people were poor and being oppressed by the few wealthy, and massacre the wealthy people and hand out all their money to the poor. So almost kind of a Robin Hood kind of deal. He would graciously reward his individual soldiers, the men serving under him, with awards and things like that. And like I said a second ago, the Asian steppe was easier to conquer than China later on. Because the Asian steppe is just so broad and flat and really had no unity. The Silk Road running through there, but there was no real unified empire until the Mongols. And China's a little bit more difficult to take over. They've got these walls, including the Great One, but each of the individual cities as well. And overall, what is this Central Asia? Well, the Central Asian steppe, which we'll see in the next slide, it's just this huge grassland. There aren't any trees, or very, very few. It's mostly just grass and shrubs, and really drastic temperature changes. It can get up to 113 degrees in the summer, 67 below in the winter. So, I mean, if you're surviving there, you're a pretty hardy individual. And in the light blue here, you can see the steppe. And the steppe probably is the origins of a lot of things: Indo-European languages, the domesticated horse, perhaps the wheel and chariot actually came out of here and then moved down into the Fertile Crescent. Who knows? But definitely a lot of cultural interaction across the Asian steppe and Central Asia. And tons of technology will be spread through this area. And just to give you some imagery of this, places like the Ukraine, you see on the left, Kazakhstan there on the right, on the bottom right, Mongolia, and on the bottom left, Temujin, Genghis Khan's birthplace. Looks like a real hospitable place there, fun place to grow up. So the Mongols were excellent learners. They're going to learn from the Chinese, they're going to learn from the Turks. how to use things like cannons and how to use things like guns, these metal tubes filled with gunpowder to launch projectiles. So essentially, the Mongols are willing to absorb knowledge. Genghis Khan also, as we'll talk about here in a second. But the thing too, though, is that as the Mongols gain all of this knowledge, all this technology, by default they spread it. So eventually this technology is going to find its way into Europe, along with some plague. But nonetheless, Genghis Khan, he's not going to live to see, this huge empire. But eventually, his heirs, especially his grandson Kublai, they're going to conquer all of China and dominate pretty much all of Asia. Simply astonishing. So overall, we can't really characterize the Mongols necessarily as oppressive rulers. They would, essentially roll in, take a place over, and then say, hey, you know what, guys, you want to be independent, just pay us tribute. So basically tributary states, though they'll call it a vassal state or vassalage. It's pretty much the same idea. But like I said, Genghis Khan and later on Kublai Khan, his grandson, they were always very open to listening to other ideas. I mean, Genghis Khan would regularly meet with Confucian, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, even Zoroastrian scholars, artists, artisans, and seek out their advice. And in Mongol society, what about women? Well, women also had quite a few more rights in Mongol society, especially compared to, say, Chinese women or even women in European places like Greece. Women trained militarily. They rode horses, shot arrows. In the household, they made decisions, in conjunction with their husbands. Domestic work at the house, or the gyr, which is basically a yurt, a round, almost tent-like structure in which they lived. Domestic work was divided between the husband and the children. When the husband, died, women could actually inherit whatever was owned by the family and then become head of household themselves. That being said, the family structure, the social order overall was still patriarchal. In other words, men, fathers in charge, and the men could also practice polygamy, meaning having more than one wife. But in Mongol society, it was always the first wife who was recognized as having the most power in that family, and only the children from that first wife could be recognized for any type of inheritance for the most part. Typically, marriages themselves were arranged between families. They would trade goods as basically bride prices and dowries, essentially. Every now and then, a woman could actually be stolen from one tribe by a man from another. Could be very dangerous. Genghis Khan's father, Isingway, for example, stole his mother, Hoyulun, from another tribe. But stealing women was not done all that often because it could lead to a blood feud between the tribes. Nonetheless, women themselves, married women, typically wore headdresses to distinguish themselves from unmarried women. And the headdresses could be pretty elaborate, as all Mongols seem to love hats and headgear. Women remained loyal to their husbands for the most part and didn't often remarry even if their husbands died. And a good illustration of this, of the power of women to influence Mongol history and culture, was Sorkhan Tuatani, the wife of Genghis Khan's son, Toyai. She had been an advisor to another of Genghis's sons, Ogodai, when he was Khan. Well, when Toyai died, she became the head of her household of sons, including a lot of kids, who all became Khans in their own time. She insisted they all become educated and learned in the languages they would need to know as leaders of an empire. After Ogdai's death, Sorkhan kept the empire together by diplomatic means, while another son was the Khan. After his death, her son Monke became great Khan. So in other words, she really took the reins and helped for a time really run the empire. She opened up trade, instituting intellectual exchanges throughout the empire, emphasized freedom of religion, and advising that conquered people should not be exploited. So, a huge role played by women overall in Mongol society. And in this case, with this illustration, the wife of one of Genghis Khan's sons. So by the 13th century, so I guess the question here is this Pax Mongolica, this Mongol peace, just how peaceful was it? Well, let's talk about it. So by the end of the 1200s, Mongol conquests had really killed about 5% of the Earth's population, and the Mongols weren't necessarily nice when they came into warfare. People really feared the Mongols. They practiced biological warfare on at least one occasion, where during the siege of Kaffa, which is on the Crimean Peninsula, that chunk of land that juts out into the northern Black Sea, in 1346, Mongol forces actually catapulted plague-infested bodies over the city walls and spread the plague. But that being said, the Mongols would also offer what we call vassalage to those they conquered. So basically, saying, hey, look, we're going to take you over, but as long as you are our vassal, you understand that you are under us, right? And you understand that you have a mutual obligation to our Khan. We'll give you military support and protection for your land, and you, of course, pay us tax, and so on. And if you resisted, though, Mongol rule, well, that meant mass destruction for you. And yeah, I mean, the Mongols really inspired fear to get opponents to capitulate or to give up and to avoid invasion and massacre. And really, this is what the Mongols relied upon for a lot of cities. Once people heard the Mongols were coming, the city gates were already open. The people who feared that they would be killed had left. And they understood that once the Mongols came to town, that the gig was up and it's now time to let the Mongols take over. So you actually have some Mongol takeovers where there's little to no bloodshed just because of the psychological aspect, this kind of psychological warfare that the Mongols played. So really obedience through fear. But yeah, the Mongols destroyed at least 90 some Chinese cities. Another city in northern Iran, they killed 1 million. Another town or another area in Turkmenistan, they killed 700,000. They destroyed crops, and fields to starve populations into submitting. And on top of that, they helped spread the plague. Really, sort of accidentally on purpose, if that makes sense, because they didn't necessarily know what the plague was per se, but they did know that if you got near somebody with the plague, that you could get this same terrible, malady on your body. So obviously, in that case, they are to an extent spreading the plague, which is going to go from Asia all the way over into Europe by the 1340s. When they invaded the Rus in Russia in the 1200s, this led to the destruction of many cities, including Moscow, killed at least 500,000 people. They actually divided the Eastern Slavic peoples, which is why today we actually have separate countries of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. But that being said, what about the environmental consequences or outcome of Mongol rule? Because the Mongols cleared and burned farmland over the course of time, they may have actually permitted forests to grow, which could have greatly reduced carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for the last 800 years. So technically, the Mongols may have staved off global warming because they would have reduced the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the air. I don't know. Is that a stretch? By the 12 and 1300s, sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, they end up creating a broader peace and order across Central Asia, and this becomes the Pax Romana, this Mongol peace. And really, this stabilizing force carried out by the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, caused a lot of economic growth. They controlled the Silk Road. They made sure it was safer for trade to continue. And they also allowed for a lot of ideas then to spread. From China, you saw the use of windmills and gunpowder move into Europe. The use of paper moved into the Middle East and later on to Europe. Crops and trees from the Middle East were carried into Eastern Asia. So because of the Mongols, we're going to see this great expansion and intermingling of trade and peoples.